And so without further ado, I want to acknowledge the original peoples of Newfoundland and Labrador, and that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups. We acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. I also want to say how honored I am to be in this room with so many women who have meant so much to me over the years, whose research in this field has been outstanding and important, whose teaching and mentoring has inspired me and so many others, and who have become my friends and colleagues and partners in crime. When I began my BA here back in 1992, one of the first courses I took was History 1000, and I immediately loved history. I also immediately realized how much I didn't know about history. I found it very grounding to learn about the past and about people's experiences in the past. Thankfully, by 1992, there were academics, librarians, archivists, here at Memorial University who had already laid the groundwork for students like me, those of us who were more interested in social history and the experiences of women in the past. I came here not even knowing that social history was a thing. The only thing I remember learning in high school about women in our history is that every day of the week they had very specific household chores to do, like baking bread on Mondays and washing clothes on Tuesdays with a washboard and a bucket and lye soap. From a teenager's perspective, this was not very exciting history. And actually, it wasn't even considered history, it was social studies. I don't mean to make light of household work because it was a significant part of women's lived experiences. And as I have a better understanding of now in my early 50s, because of research done by several people in this room, women and their household work was crucial to the viability of families, to the survival of everyone of European descent who settled here, and to the transition of this place from a migratory to a resident fishery. Can I lower this a little bit? Okay. Which Willeen emphasizes in her research on the women of the Southern Avalon. This is, there's multi-layered meaning in women's household production and subsistence work, and a lot of significance in that work, but it was a one-dimensional interpretation of women in our history. And there's so much that we didn't learn in high school in the early 1990s. We didn't learn about women who were not wives and mothers, women who chose careers and independence and what that would have meant for them, or about women who worked in dangerous conditions. We didn't learn about Indigenous women's lives and experiences beyond Shanawdithit, whose significance was tied to, as Julia Late discusses in her research, a settler colonial fantasy that imagined Indigenous peoples as disappeared or extinct. We didn't learn about the significance of women's church and community groups and philanthropic work in the days before the Social Security programs, or about the various ways in which women advocated, organized, and exerted political influence before and after the vote. We didn't even learn about the vote and women's suffrage. We didn't learn about women interfacing with the state and the justice system. We didn't learn about women's sexuality or gender identity, or that people who were gender diverse even existed in the past. We didn't learn about women who contributed to visual art, literature, poetry, filmmaking, storytelling, and culture. Women who were authors, poets, painters, musicians, women who invited neighbors into their kitchens and played accordion for them so that they could have a time. We didn't learn about the myriad ways in which women in the past managed, overcame, contributed, persevered, picked themselves up, and rose up. I don't want to sound too celebratory because there are still so many gaps in the research, and this history, as with all history, is complicated. And women's and gender diverse people's experiences were not uniform at all. But we'll talk more about this over the next couple of days. But we have come a long way since the early 1990s, when many of these topics would not have been considered history at all. So there I was in the mid-1990s, a BA student at MUN, trying to decide what to focus on for my honors essay. And I was immediately leaning towards a non-Newfoundland topic, I'm ashamed to say. I was not interested in the saltfish trade or the Labrador fishery or the seal hunt. And I really didn't know what else there was about Newfoundland history to be excited about. So I decided on the non-Newfoundland topic for my honors essay. I met with my potential supervisor. I was so excited about my chosen topic, and he was so not. He would supervise me, but it was clear that he wouldn't be happy about it. The meeting with him was jarring, but it wouldn't be the first time I've had a male prof disgruntled because I was making him think about women's history. It happened to me at Queen's as well, but I digress. So I left his office in a bit of a deflated daze, turned and walked down the hall and knocked on the door of Terry Bishop Sterling. She happened to be in her office at the time, and it all may have seemed a bit random. I hadn't done a course with Terry before, and I had only a vague idea about something about women and the First World War. But she took it on, and she was great. She provided encouragement and direction, and we have since worked on several projects together over the years and have become good friends. And coming out of that meeting to get a better understanding of women in Newfoundland and Labrador history, one of the first books she recommended was Pursuing Equality: Historical Perspectives on Women in Newfoundland and Labrador, which I meant to bring with me today, but I forgot this morning. Pursuing Equality was edited by our very own plenary speaker this morning, Dr. Linda Keeley. Dr. Keeley was recruited by the History Department in 1980 and became instrumental in advancing the study of women's and gender history here. She arrived at Memorial in the fall of 1980 to fill a sudden vacancy for a one-year term. Her significant other, Dr. Greg Keeley, was on sabbatical from Dalhousie that year, so the timing was opportune. They moved here with their 2-year-old. Dr. Keeley finished her PhD from the University of Toronto while teaching her own courses for the first time. Can we just take a moment? And somebody at Memorial knew a good thing when they saw it, because the two Drs. Keeley were offered jobs, and the one-year contract turned into almost 22 years. While at Memorial, Dr. Keeley developed courses in women's history and became involved with a group of women who were interested in starting the Women's Studies program. She served as program supervisor for several terms and helped develop the master's program, and led several initiatives to further the exploration of women's history. She supervised and mentored over 24 graduate students over the course of her career, both at Memorial and UNB. She also served 2 terms as head of the history department here and became involved in national organizations such as the Canadian Institute for the Advancement of Women, the Canadian Historical Association, and Canadian Women's Studies Association, and the journal Atlantis. Select publications, in addition to Pursuing Equality, include Outport Girls in Service, Newfoundland in the 1920s and 30s, Historical Perspectives on Nutrition and Food Security in Newfoundland and Labrador, On the Edge of Empire, The Working Life of Myra Grimsley Bennett, and most recently, From Dreams of Equality to 100 Years of Struggle, Radical Women's Biographies in the History of Canadian Politics. Dr. Keeley is currently Professor Emerita at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton. She is happy to be back at Memorial for this event, and we are happy that her flight got in yesterday, considering this weekend weather, and wind knows no season in Newfoundland. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Linda Keeley.
Let me know if you can hear me. Is it clear? Teaching voice, right? Use your teaching voice. Anyway, thank you all for inviting me to this wonderful, auspicious occasion, honoring the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in Newfoundland and Labrador. I mean, this is an important event across all of Canada, and there have been centennial celebrations, as I'm sure you know, in all the provinces. And I'm going to skip over some of this because Margot's already talked about it. But I highly recommend to you that Veronica Strong-Bogue of UBC, now a professor emerita, has a 6-volume series on the history of women's suffrage in Canada. And so you can consult that. Newfoundland is covered in Heidi MacDonald's 2023 We Shall Persist volume. So if you want to do further research, I suggest that that might be a good place to start. Okay, skipping Margot. Wonderful. I intend to spend my time recalling and pinpointing the importance of remembering the struggles of those women and some men whose visions were of a more equal, just, and fair society, encompassing the contributions of women and other disenfranchised groups. Much was hidden from history, the title of one of those early books that we had. until the women's movement of the post-World War II era began to question, received wisdom, particularly in the 60s, my generation, and beyond, though we need to remember that there have always been questioners about women's position in history. And indeed, we ought to remember and celebrate those who not only questioned, but acted to change things. But as we spend the next few days looking at the role of women in gender history in helping to jumpstart that change, I think it's necessary to pause and reflect in these chaotic times to confront the real threats that face us and the need to keep history and women and gender history in particular in front of us to fight the disinformation and the threats that are coming to us not only from south of the border, but mostly from there, although spreading all over the world. And to think about the fact that in September, I came across an article in The Guardian by columnist Arwa Madawi, which suggested that many men, particularly in the United States, were thinking about disenfranchising women in order to have a family vote. That is based on Christian morals. And obviously that is a step backwards. Here again, as in the past, religion is being used to keep women in their so-called place. And as Madawi noted in her Guardian article, these ideas are being pushed by some of the most powerful people in the US. I was shocked when I read it. Probably shouldn't have been. So the need is even greater now to make our history front and center and support not only women's and gender history, but also the programs that support that, and to strengthen ties within the feminist movement and within the community at large. But enough of that negativity. Today we're here to celebrate and remember our history and accomplishments, and my story is a part of that trend, so I hope you will forgive me if I sometimes reference my own trajectory and that of former students here along the path of questioning, research, writing, and mobilizing with women and gender history. In general, I have focused on those who have identified and written with women's and gender history. So not every relevant historical project can be mentioned here. There are several themes I want to follow that will illustrate how we got here. And of course, there will be variations among our experiences and our interactions with women's and gender history and its relationship to the feminist movement. And of course, in the next session, we will discuss those, I'm sure. The first theme is activism and the women's movement of the 60s and 70s. Involvement in women's groups in those early days helped me, as well as others, ask questions, not only about the present, but the past. Thinking about why men and women played different roles meant questioning biological determinism. Remember that old expression? But it also led to questioning racism as well as class differences. Questioning sex differences helped to uncover the social, political, economic, and cultural constructions of difference. And this questioning helped to bring us to adopt gender rather than just women into our language and to talk about other questions. So, as university students, exploring those questions on the left, meaning those who were critical of the socioeconomic system of capitalism, we broke away, I mean we and some of my friends, we broke away from men's groups, left-wing women, men's group, into women-only groups. We questioned those biological assumptions, but also the roles that women played in the past, and those included why were so few women in politics. We also began to interrogate other givens, sexual identity, domestic violence, and more. And of course, women with other political allegiances, not just left-wing women, also questioned this. By the late 60s and early 70s, essays and books by women activists began to appear in the United States and the United Kingdom, questioning those traditional historical accounts. As the preface to the 1971 publication, American one, Liberation Now, Writings from the Women's Movement, the Women's Liberation Movement in 1971, insisted the politics of women's liberation tells us that history must be redefined. In Canada, similar questioning started to arise. fueled not only by women's activism, but also by academic trends. The new social history that foregrounded class and race as categories of analysis joined sex and gender. In these early days, as a beginning graduate student, I joined a collective in Toronto at the Canadian Women's Educational Press. Now, most of us were not historians, or we were historians in the making. And we came from a variety of lines of work, but we produced one of the earliest collections on women's history in Canada focused on women's labor in 1974. Women at Work Ontario, 1850 to 1930, appeared in 74 and won the City of Toronto Book Prize the next year, much to our surprise. So this brings me to my second theme, the role of communities of activists and scholar activists. Now, I need water. My background was in sociology. And I had a professional library degree. I worked as a children's librarian in my earlier life. But I lived in a house full of graduate students while I was working. And with the encouragement of those students and two University of Toronto women's history professors, that is Natalie Zeman Davis and Jill Kerr-Conway, whose names may not be familiar to all of you. But with their support and that of my partner, I went back to graduate school and started doing history. So in this decade of the 70s now, women's studies programs began to evolve and emerge. Feminist historians in Canada became active in creating what became the Canadian Committee on Women's History in 1975, which was affiliated to the Canadian Historical Association. The Canadian Women's Studies Association started in the early 80s, 82, with the involvement of a number of historians again, although there were other academics involved as well. These national bodies of scholars and scholar activists have provided much needed support for individuals, but have also pushed our disciplines towards equity, diversity, and inclusion, those words that today cause so much trouble in the world, apparently. So my third theme is the early focus on the history of women and work in politics, and that's where I started, women's labor. One of the early concerns of the early feminist movement itself was women's paid labor and pay discrimination, something that still is a problem, still rankles. Influenced by the growth of social and labor history, which paid more attention to those not often credited with historical agency, such as workers, immigrants, slaves, and others, historians of women's work turned their attention to female factory workers, domestic servants, working women's labor activism. This initial focus was challenged in the mid-80s, rethinking of what we called the sexual division of labor. Particularly, I remember by historian Bettina Bradbury of York University, who took a wider view of women's work to encompass women's work within the family economy and to contextualize the whole idea of the male breadwinner family. Within the international women's movement, at the same time, wages for housework campaigns began to emerge and challenged the emphasis on paid work, stirring up controversy within the academic world, as well as the feminist community. Critics feared that such campaigns for wages for housework would reinforce women's domestic roles and undercut the pay equity movement and other important changes to paid labor. Historians of women's work also began to explore the significant roles of women workers in immigrant communities, often through domestic service and factory work. Not only European migrants, but also Asian, South Asian, Italian, and Jewish women, as well as women of color. Interest in women in politics often emerged through the studies of the women's suffrage movement, as well as electoral politics and studies of women in the legal system. Moreover, the work of Canadian women historians challenged the long-held assumption that once women obtained the vote, they retreated from public life, and everything was handy-dandy and all fixed. But we know with the return of second wave feminism that all was not well. Beyond the Vote, Canadian Women in Politics, which I co-edited with Joan Sangster in 1989, pulled together chapters on women's political activism in mainstream political movements, as well as the peace movement and left-leaning formations. Left-wing women's history began to garner interest in the 80s, with Sangster's work on women involved in the CCF, the Canadian Commonwealth Federation, which was later the NDP, and my own work on left-wing women in early socialism and the left also was a product of that kind of interest for a while in left-wing women's politics. So how do these themes fit or not the experiences of this province, particularly the development of women's and gender history, and more broadly, the crossovers to a developing feminist community? Newfoundland and Labrador women were catalyzed by many of the same trends as elsewhere in Canada. As Sharon Gray Pope and Jane Burnham's essay in Pursuing Equality, which Heidi referred to, that early collection first published in 93 and then again in 99, Pursuing Equality, Historical Perspectives on Women in Newfoundland, it documents the 70s and the 80s as key with national events such as the Royal Commission on the Status of Women and International Women's Year in 1975. This province sent many briefs to those commissions looking at pay discrimination, tax policies, and other economic issues affecting women. They noted the importance of groups here in Newfoundland, such as the Social Action Committee of the YWCA, and the founding of the Newfoundland, as we called it then, Status of Women Council, later changed to the St. John's Women's Status of Women Council, as well as the growth of women's centers around the province. Their account outlines the beginning and growth of Status of Women Councils around the province, among other developments. As Linda Cullum and Maeve Baird wrote in their essay in that book, A Woman's Lot, Women in the Law in Newfoundland from Early Settlement to the 20th Century, in much of the historical writing on Newfoundland, women appear as wives, daughters, makers of fish, without stories of their own. They began the process then, these authors, of primary research into court documents and newspaper accounts of legal cases dealing with property, sexual assault, divorce, employment, and much more. Their essay complemented Margot's essay, of course, her pioneering historical account of women's suffrage. And of course, Margot published her own book-length study of suffrage that year, Where Once Our Mothers Stood, We Stand. So the publication of Pursuing Equality, I think, was important. It was an early effort to kickstart women's and gender history in this province. Like Women at Work, Ontario, the earlier book I referred to, this volume was the brainchild of a group of women active in academia, but also within the growing women's movement. Membership varied over time, but included MUN faculty, writers like Bernice Morgan, women in various organizations, and of course the collection's authors, with advice and assistance from the federal and provincial governments, as well as the Law Foundation, which helped. I remember it was Roberta Buchanan, Ann Hart, Leanne Montgomery, Martha Mazichka, Pat O'Brien, and I probably have forgotten all kinds of people's names, and please forgive my bad memory. But we got together, we had support from the Provincial Advisory Council, Ann Bell, Wendy Williams, people like that, as well as Carmelita McGraw. Started in 1987, the group eventually realized that we needed direction and organization to produce this collection, Pursuing Equality, and so I was persuaded to take on the role of editor. Other books on Canadian women's history just ignored the Atlantic region, a point that was made by my former colleague at UNB, Gail Campbell, in 1990. And we recognized the need to write the history of women in this province, even if we could only address a limited number of topics, mainly women's roles in public life. So some historians have made a distinction, this is a quote from the introduction, While some historians have made a distinction between women's domestic or private lives and the public world of men's activities, this distinction has often hidden the important relationships between the public and the private in both women's and men's lives, unquote. While the collection only addressed the public sphere, it was a start. The Institute for Social and Economic Research at MUN published it, adding it to titles on women by social scientists such as Donna Lee Davis on menopause, Cecilia Benoit on midwives, Davis and Jane Nadell Klein on women in fishing economies. Much of that social science literature focused on women in the fishery and in outport communities. Important studies that are too numerous to mention here, but I want to acknowledge that sociologists and anthropologists and folklorists have contributed immensely to the subject of women's and gender history before we were even thinking about it, I think, as an organized group. And then we began to have graduate students that began to explore the untapped sources on women's experiences, and more would follow. In her essay for Creating a University, The Newfoundland Experience, which was published in 2019, edited by Roberta Buchanan and Stephen Riggins, Marilyn Porter writes that she arrived at Memorial in 1980, same year I did. And she found herself teaching all the women's courses in the sociology department. As the lone feminist in the department, she had lots of students, but observed that they had few connections to the wider feminist community, a separation that persisted until the Women's Studies program was created, again by an assortment of women faculty who were volunteering their time and were able to push through a minor in women's studies in 1983. We might want to debate that point about the connection between women's studies and the feminist community. I remember it a little differently. One of my memories of getting the program approved was the Dean of Arts' comment that I will support that program as long as it costs me no budget. Familiar, isn't it? As Porter notes, a Women's Studies Council preceded the actual program and involved faculty, including myself, Roberta, Joanne Prindiville was in anthropology at the time, Kathy Penny in psychology, and others I'm afraid my feeble memory will not recall. And then, of course, the minor became a reality, and finally, we hired a full-time person, Ellen Balka, who was the first full-time faculty member in women's studies. And Joan Scott, from the science side of things, was eventually involved as well as others that I may not mention here. In her essay in the volume, Scott recalls teaching the introductory course, Women's Studies 2000, with Roberta Buchanan as a great student-centered learning experience. And it was challenging, really challenging, to try to develop interdisciplinary courses that began and capped the women's studies minor. And later the program, of course, incorporated a major and a master's degree before becoming a full-time department in 2006. I was long gone by then. Those who are participating in the next roundtable on second wave feminist activism will surely have comments to make on some of these observations about the feminist community here and its interaction with women's studies. But I do remember my own involvement with the St. John's Status of Women Council, the Women's Center on Military Road, where we had so many meetings. And I know that many of us in the program thought of ourselves as the academic wing of the women's movement at that time. Our university teaching and our research were part and parcel of our feminist involvement. The 1990s and after witnessed a noticeable growth of interest in publishing in women's and gender history, including personal stories of individuals. Those early memoirs and autobiographies written by Elizabeth Gowdy, Millicent Blake Loader, Lydia Campbell, and others were followed in the 90s by Helen Buss, AKA Margaret Clark's story of growing up in 1940s and 1950s Newfoundland, an important collection of Innu women's voices, It's Like a Legend. edited by Nympha Byrne and Camille Fouillard. That was published in 2000. Indeed, several collections of articles and archival material appeared in print in the 90s and later, such as Their Lives and Times, Women in Newfoundland and Labrador, a collage, edited by Carmelita McGraw, Barb Neese, and Marilyn Porter in 1995. And again in 2006, Linda Cullum, McGrath, and Porter put together a cornucopia of documents, articles, letters, recollections, fiction, and poetry. In Weather's Edge, Women in Newfoundland and Labrador, a compendium. Cullum and Porter, the editors of Creating This Place, Women, Family, and Class in St. John's, 1900 to 1950, published in 2014, featured urban experiences. Some individuals took the spotlight, such as labor ally and suffragist mentioned last night by Margot, Julia Salter Earle, the poet, Phoebe Florence Miller, and the suffragist Armine Gosling. But other articles addressed women active in Anglican and Catholic churches, the Jubilee Guilds, social reform, and education. Much less common has been the integration of Newfoundland and Labrador women's history, or even Atlantic Canadian women's history, into Canadian women's and gender history generally. Notable exceptions here that I mention are Sarah Glassford and Amy Shaw's 2 volumes on women's roles during the First and Second World Wars. A Sisterhood of Suffering and Service on the First World War featured an essay by Terry Bishop Sterling on overseas nursing. And the second volume, Making the Best of It on the Second World War, I note contains an essay by Heidi Coombs on nursing history. And I believe Vicki Hallett has an essay in that as well. So here and there we see some integration, but by and large, there's not a lot. Women's work has remained a key focus in women's and gender history, as these 2 essays I just referred to suggest. And indeed, healthcare work has been a prominent theme here in the historiography of the province, not surprisingly given the remoteness of many communities in the past. Women provided much of the needed healthcare available, particularly as midwives and nurses. Think back to Joyce Nevitt's 1978 book, White Caps, Black Mans, which appeared so long ago. And I would be remiss not to remember Linda White's 1992 thesis, The General Hospital School of Nursing, 1903 to 1934. One of my students, Victoria Belbin, wrote about Northern Peninsula nurse midwife Myra Bennett and helped get her papers deposited in the archives. I also wrote about her in Myra Rotherdale's collection, Caregiving on the Periphery, Historical Perspectives on Nursing and Midwifery in Canada. Given its importance in northern Newfoundland and Labrador, the Grenfell Mission has received an immense amount of work in the history of healthcare, including the work of some of my former students. Jill Perry did an MA on nursing for the Grenfell Mission. Heidi did her 2010 doctoral thesis, continuing the analysis for the later years. In addition, my MA student, Gail Lush, worked on nutrition workers, health, education, and dietary reform at the mission between the 1890s and the late 1920s. So much of this latter work was supported by and stemmed from a major research project on coastal communities in BC and Newfoundland and Labrador titled Coasts Under Stress, Restructuring and Social Ecological Health, headed by my colleague and friend Rosemary Omar, who very sadly died 6 months ago in BC, and I miss her. This wide-ranging multidisciplinary project produced not only academic studies of significant processes of change in fishing and other rural communities on both coasts, but it also drew attention to the importance of local and Indigenous knowledge in these communities through the illustrated 2-volume magnificent book, Towards an Encyclopedia of Local Knowledge by artist Pam Hall and her collaborators. Work on the Grenfell Mission, of course, has been extended in research in recent years, carried out by Jim Connor, Jennifer Connor, and Catherine Seid. Paid and domestic work have been prominent themes in this province's history, particularly in fishing and rural communities, as I mentioned. As Marilyn Porter once wrote about women in fishing communities, she was the skipper of the shore crew. more attention began to be paid to other kinds of work as research widened to encompass urban areas and small towns. As Nancy Forrestal noted in her '87 MA thesis, Women's Paid Labor in St. John's between the two world wars, female occupations were limited to a few areas, with domestic service attracting large numbers of young outport women. Class, as well as gender, was crucial in patterns of women's work. And as the production of consumer goods increased, so did the employment of working class women in boot, shoe, clothing, confectionery, cordage, and tobacco industries in St. John's. As Forrestal's research has shown, women began to organize into unions between the two world wars. During the First World War, under the leadership again of Julia Salter Earle, whose name keeps coming up, and later with the formation of the Newfoundland Trades and Labor Council in the late 30s. While most women remained outside the union movement, the labor movement, these studies uncovered new information relating to their work and organization. Domestic service, however, was not merely an urban occupation where young outport women worked in upper middle class and elite homes. Ingrid Botting's 2000 doctoral thesis, Getting a Grand Falls Job, found that there was a steady demand for domestics in the pulp and paper mill town, where mill women workers, who often shared their employer's religion, ethnicity, and social origins, thus raising, because they shared these, this raises questions, I think, about their relationships. To what extent did common backgrounds challenge the hierarchical relationships between employer and employee? Kinship ties often helped young women find work, including in St. John's. Oral histories with former domestics from the Girls in Service Project involving the English department's Bernie O'Dwyer and Bernice Schrank and myself from history in the 90s revealed that middle-class households employed domestics more so than many North American cities in the 1920s and 30s. The interviewees revealed that they were not just subordinates, they asserted agency when they defied curfew, quit without notice, sued for unpaid wages, and demanded better working conditions. Of course, domestics were subject to abuse and poor working conditions and living conditions. But for most women from the outports, this was their most likely option for paid employment. While conditions could vary, class mattered, as well as gender, and households could be in places of both conflict and resistance. So you can see that in my own thinking and in many of the students that I've had, class, gender, ethnicity, all mattered in our story in Newfoundland women's history. Historians have not been the only researchers interested in women's work, though I've concentrated on their contributions. Historical sociology, as I've mentioned before, has also contributed immensely to our understanding of women's labor, including work by Porter, Barb Neese, Linda Cullum, and others, too numerous to discuss here. Again, I refer to Linda Cullum's study, Narratives at Work, Women, Men, and Women, Men, Unionization, and the Fashioning of Identities is one of those examples. It explores how women's work experiences shaped gendered identities and subjectivities. As one reviewer noted, readers got a clear sense of how work in the fish and frozen food packing industry reproduced gender and class inequality in work conditions and wages in late 40s St. John's. Here also is a detailed account by those involved of the organization of the Joe Brothers plant and the accompanying work routines, the camaraderie, the family and social life that they relate. So these studies of women's work reveal the importance of the archival as well as oral sources in tracing the complicated stories of women's history. Just as important as the data we rely on are the analytical lenses that we bring to flesh out women's labor. Class and gender are key, but it is also necessary to keep in mind ethnic and religious factors. Willeen Keough's book, mentioned by Margot last night, The Slender Thread, Irish Women on the Southern Avalon, uses a variety of written and oral sources to trace the settlement patterns of this area by Irish migrants, at first largely a male phenomenon that gradually attracted excuse me, that gradually attracted women migrants too, although in small numbers. She argues that unlike English Protestant women, these Irish Catholic women enjoyed unusual degrees of personal and collective agency as they created a family fishing economy and permanent settlements that replaced a transient male migration pattern and kept cultural traditions alive. The weakness of clerical and secular authorities reduced the influence of religious and bourgeois values, leaving room for women to contest patriarchal norms. The intersection of women's work and religion is also, of course, the subject of Bonnie Morgan's prize-winning volume, Ordinary Saints, Women, Work, and Faith in Newfoundland, which came out in 2019 and won a Canadian Historical Association prize in 2020. In the context of significant social, economic, and political changes of the mid-20th century, Morgan explores how working class Anglican women on the southern shore of Conception Bay navigated their relationships with the official church and challenged clerical authority. Their communities, through knitting, tea making, sales, textiles, other fundraising events, these women lived their religion through their work and resisted pressure from the church. So, while so much interesting work has been done here, what needs more attention? And I seem to have lost the last few pages of my talk. And here. Well, I would draw attention. Somehow, I don't know where they went. In my concluding remarks on the paper, I did draw attention to things that we still need to do. Number one, Indigenous women's history. I know of Andrea Proctor's book, and I know that she has done some very good work on looking into residential schools. And I'm also aware of the wonderful biography of Elizabeth Panashaway that Elizabeth Yeomans pulled together. And I think, I mean, everywhere in Canada, but particularly here, I think we know a lot less about Indigenous women and their lives, their culture, their politics. The second thing is sexuality. Much less has been done on the history of sexuality in this province that I'm aware of anyway. And I'm not necessarily totally up to date on all of this. But I know that Ria Roman has come out with a very recent queer history of Newfoundland that really is the first of its kind, as far as I know, in this part of the world, in this province. So those were the two areas that I would say need a lot more development. However, I would not eliminate concentration still on doing more on women's work and politics, because we still don't know a lot about those topics. I remember the 52% solution. How many of you remember the 52% solution? Has anyone ever done a story? Has anyone ever done a research project on that? I don't think so. And I think we know a lot less about women in politics here. And so these are fertile areas that could still be explored by those who are wishing to do more work in Newfoundland and Labrador women's history. I'm sure there's much more that can be done in legal history, which was started by Sharon Gray Pope and Jane Burnham long ago. Anyway, I'm sorry, I don't know what happened to the rest of these pages, but that is the gist of what I wanted to say. And I thank you for allowing me to do that. Oh, here they are. Okay, on time, I'm not going to say much more. Women's organizations was one I left out. While we have some studies on women's groups, such as the Jubilee Guilds and the WCTU, there are so many other women's groups that we don't know anything about. And so many other areas, as I mentioned, of women's work, retail work, childcare, all kinds of things that we don't know. So I would just leave you with the thought that We have more to do. We also have some wonderful books that I noticed are coming out. The journey's not over. We need to keep going on celebrating women's history and gender history and fill in those gaps that I've mentioned. But I note, of course, Margot's book is out already, but I note there is advertisement now for Heather Barrett's The Mill Girls, the Newfoundland Women Who Transformed Canada's Industrial Heartland, which is coming out imminently, I guess. It's out, okay. And then Vicki Hallett and Sonia Boone's Dear Mr. Smallwood, Confederation in the Words of Those Who Lived It. And I assume there are many women quoted in there that would be of great interest to this group. So I don't want to leave you on a negative note, but I think we need to be vigilant in these times. The way things are going is not encouraging, and I think we need to keep history, all history, but women and gender history, particularly in the forefront, and to not let people take those rights away. They are fragile, very fragile. And please do keep up the good work, and I hope our discussion continues how to do that. Thanks, and sorry about missing on my pages.